Video I'm going to be comparing the never-ending story franchise to the Highlander franchise. In the case of never-ending story, you have only 3 movies. Of Highlander, you actually have 6 movies. So when it comes to highest score for each franchise, in the case of never-ending story, the original movie, unsurprisingly, has the highest score of 84%. Of Highlander, highest score is a 69% for actually both the original movie along with Search for Vengeance, the anime Highlander movie. Neverending Story wins here. Then when you look at lowest score for each franchise, of Neverending Story Part 2 only has a 14%, with Highlander 3 only has a 5%. Yikes, that's bad. A Neverending Story wins again. And then when you look at average, a Neverending Story, you have an average of 41. With Highlander, you have an average of 34. Neverending Story wins again. And then when you look at gap between lowest and highest score, with Neverending Story, it's pretty big, a gap of 70 between the two scores. Of Highlander, you have a gap of 58. So Highlander wins this round, but because Neverending Story already won 3 rounds, Neverending Story is going to win this debate regardless of my personal opinion. Let's look at it now. Which franchise do I prefer? In the case of Neverending Story, the idea here is that you have this book called The Neverending Story, which actually has magic to it. So when someone reads this book, they're basically transported into the world of the book. And if someone else reads it, then they can learn about what this person's up to in the story. I think that's a really creative, interesting idea, interesting way to do fantasy movie. I actually, to be honest, enjoy all 3 of the Neverending Story movies. The second and third one weren't well received whatsoever, but I actually had fun with those movies. I think the world of Fantasia is a fun one to spend time in. I like spending time with these characters. I think Bastion is a good main character. He's likable and endearing. I think the visuals in these movies overall are good. I mean, are there ways in which they're dated? Sure, you could definitely say that, but I think that they don't look bad. I like the stories are being told here. And with Highlander, I think you have a really creative, interesting premise about these superpowered beings that are competing to see who is going to kill the other one. By the end of the first movie, that question is resolved. So you do see what the problem there is. So you have a great, interesting, fun premise that also doesn't lend itself to more stories, because by the end of the first film we get an answer to that question of who's going to be the one Highlander to survive. So then after that, it feels like they have to rewrite the mythology a lot to try to force more stuff out of there than what's really there. Just within the last few days, actually, I did watch Highlander Search for Vengeance, because I was like, oh, okay, this is actually the only Highlander movie other than the first one that actually got good reviews, as the same Rotten Tomatoes score as the first film. I checked it out. I ended up watching it on YouTube. I actually really enjoyed this one. It's about a Highlander who actually lost his wife, and then he became immortal. And so we learned that for hundreds of years, this guy hasn't lived for anything other than vengeance. He's been on a never ending quest to kill this other Highlander that murdered his wife. And we see that the tragic thing about this guy is that he doesn't have anything to live for other than rage, hatred, pain, vengeance. He's focused so much on his own grief of losing his wife and desire for revenge that he's not seeing all the stuff that he's missing out on, all the things he's neglecting by being so single mindedly focused on this one thing. But then by the end of the movie, he actually grows in that regard. I like the way this movie looks. I think the anime look is really interesting. And I like the characters here. The story is engaging. when it comes to which franchise I prefer, I would say that Neverending Story is actually the one I prefer. I think that the fundamental premise of Neverending Story is one that naturally lends itself to more stories, whereas with Highlander, you have a fun, interesting premise that doesn't really lend itself to more movies other than one. So that's why with Highlander, you have a franchise with a great movie in it, but it's not a great franchise. So, Never Ending Story, I think it's different. I like seeing the winged creature Falcor, that other person in Fantasia, the childlike empress, the horse, and all the other creatures that we see in this world. I think that's really interesting. Like they have this kid Bastion who we see in the second movie. He doesn't think that his father really cares about him, but then he actually realizes his father does by the end. So they both say "I love you" to each other, which is really heartwarming. And then the third movie is about this kid moving to a new place. He's going to a different school, and he actually has a sister now, but he doesn't think that she's actually his sister at first. And he's having trouble fitting in at this school because there's this mean group of kids that are all out to get him. But then that changes by the end of the movie, changes what's said in the never ending story, so his life is actually better. I like in the first film him discovering this world of Fantasia for the first time, learning all these different things about it, going to that bookstore for the first time. So I would definitely say that I'd have more fun with Neverending Story. In this case, I've actually seen all the movies in the franchise, whereas with Highlander right now, I've only seen two of the movies, so not a lot. That'll wrap things up for today.